Today, I'm going to do the same thing I did with the Raven. I'm going to just sit here without notes and I'm going to tell you what went down with A Christmas Carol, how Charles Dickens got his name attached to it, and how Abby Poyen Whittier and Matthew Franklin Whittier, the real co-authors, ended up being shut out of the picture. And this is not going to be proof. The proof is in my papers, and in one paper in particular. If you go into the articles section of this website, my website, and look for the paper on A Christmas Carol, you will find all the details there. I've taken it down off of Academia EDU for the time being because I've submitted a paper on this subject to a scholarly journal, and I told them, I believe, that I had taken it down from Academia EDU, but this particular paper is longer, quite a bit longer, and it was published in Real Paranormal Magazine, so there's no reason why I shouldn't have that paper accessible for download on my website. So the first thing to understand about A Christmas Carol is that it contains real metaphysics, real mysticism, and real paranormal phenomena, very much the way that Bruce Joel Rubin, the writer of the movie Ghost, who is a serious student of Kundalini Yoga, embedded real occult phenomena in his film. His idea was for everything to be authentic as much as possible, given that it's a Hollywood production, and it is. And the same, I think, was Abby Poyen Whittier's idea about A Christmas Carol. So it means that the real author or authors of that story had to be deeply knowledgeable about the perennial philosophy and about the paranormal and about the occult. And Charles Dickens was not. So right there, it's impossible that he could be the original author. And if you have studied these things, as I have for almost 50 years, if you look at A Christmas Carol, you know that there's authentic metaphysics in that. And there is not in any of Charles Dickens' other productions, including his Christmas productions. So right there, it's basically proof positive. It's impossible that it could be Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens was the popularizer. He watered it down. He sensationalized it like he did a number of other things, I think, by way of plagiarism or imitation or whatever. And he had the knack of getting the large numbers of people, the masses, to read his work. But he didn't originate these things. So that's the first thing to understand. The second thing is to understand what this was. This was intended to bring each individual reader through a spiritual turning, a turning of the heart, a conversion experience. But I hesitate to use the word conversion because I don't mean conversion to a dogma or an ideology or a religion, adopting a set of beliefs. I don't mean that. It's something deeper. It's real conversion. I myself, in my late teens, I think it was, maybe 19, I had a conversion experience. And my conversion experience was that I had been raised an atheist and I was completely and utterly lost is what I felt. And I think I've been doing Zen meditation and nothing wrong with Zen meditation. But at some point, all of a sudden, I was sitting on the stool and I just turned to God inwardly and I said, I'm a mess. I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm lost. I'm a complete mess. First time I'd ever spoken to God, and his presence filled me immediately. It was like he'd just been waiting all that time for me to turn to him. It was, bang, just like that, whoosh, and I'd never felt that before. He was right there. So, and that had nothing, I didn't convert to any religion or any belief system or anything. See, so this is what I mean by turning of the heart, conversion. See, well, that's what A Christmas Carol is designed to do. And that's why the chapters are in staves, because stave is a double entendre. It is musical, and Abby was a musical prodigy and an excellent musician. But a stave is also rungs on a ladder. So each chapter is a rung on a ladder towards this conversion experience. Now, why nobody's ever picked up on this before, I've never read this anywhere, but it's pretty obvious, especially when I know that Matthew and Abby, Matthew in particular, love puns and double meanings, see? So that's the second thing to understand. Likewise, Dickens was a worldly man. He thought it was a ghost story, so he couldn't possibly have been the author of this. So then you get into, and in the paper, I get into other reasons why Charles Dickens couldn't possibly be the author. I don't think I'll delve into that. I want to talk about how this happened. So Matthew and Abby had a little boy, Joseph, and as near as I can tell, he was an old soul, and they knew that he was an old soul, and he was very precious to them. And he died of scarlet fever under tragic circumstances. The gist was that they were being badly persecuted and shunned, and they had to live in a poor area. And Matthew decided to go to visit a man named Thomas Chandler in Michigan and try to see if he could move the family there, if he could get work. He'd written to him 3 times, and finally he went out there in August of 1838. And when he came back, as near as I can tell, that's the timing, when he came back, he found that Joseph had died. And it was apparently a local scarlet fever epidemic. I have my ideas as to how it happened, but a lot of it has to do with the poverty that they were forced to live under, I think. And Matthew's second cousin, Richard Whittier, who lived in Methuen, Massachusetts, not very far from Amesbury and Haverhill, which was their area in Massachusetts, invited them to come and live with him. I have evidence of that they did, in fact, live with him. And probably for a month or two before they ended up coming here where I am now to Portland, Maine. And they would have started work on A Christmas Carol. And I feel and think that the way that this happened was that Abby was so disconsolate that Matthew was afraid she was just going to starve herself to death or throw herself in the river or something. She may have felt partly responsible. I think that she may have left little Joseph in the care of her older brother, and he was careless and exposed Joseph to scarlet fever. I don't know. There's some circumstances around this that are mysterious. But anyway, whatever it is, she may have felt responsible, and he was afraid that he'd lose her. So what he did was they had both of them, each of them, written inspiring stories that were in this same genre, redemption genre. And there was one in particular called The New Year's Bells that Matthew had written probably back in 1830. And there was other stories that Abby had written. She was, of course, the metaphysical one, and Matthew had a more traditional Quaker background and was a philosopher, skeptical in some ways, but she had brought him around on some of these esoteric matters to where they both strongly believed in them. They certainly believed in life after death and spirits and spirit contact and probably spirit guides and the life review and the other things that are in A Christmas Carol. So they were both on board with these things. Matthew was a very good storyteller, had a tremendous sense of humor, wry sense of humor, was an excellent writer. And Abby knew the occult and the paranormal and mysticism backwards and forwards. And she was no mean writer herself. So they decided to collaborate, and Matthew brought it to her that way. He says, look, we've been talking for some years about writing something that would help to transform mankind, to do our part to alleviate the suffering of mankind and to transform society spiritually. And he said, now's the time. We'll take our pain and we'll transmute it into this work that will help others. And he was able to get her on board with that. And since they were both suffering terribly, and it's hard to be creative when you're suffering, they started with The New Year's Bells as a template and brought in the other stories and put them together and started writing this. And the deal was that Matthew would write Scrooge and come up with the plot, which was kind of similar to The New Year's Bells. But Abby would write all the spiritual parts, the spirits, the life review, earthbound spirits, the idea that higher spirits have a higher rate of vibration and that if you touch them, they'll raise your rate of vibration, and there might even be the possibility of levitating. And Abby also had a deep knowledge of psychology, so she has Ebenezer Scrooge go back to his childhood, which Matthew actually had in The New Year's Bells. Probably she helped him write that one too back in around 1830. So there's all these elements, paranormal elements, that Abby put in. She wrote the ghosts' speeches, Marley's speech and the spirits of Christmas, past, present, and future, those speeches. I'm not even sure they really were spirits of past, present, and future originally. I don't know whose idea that was, but I think she just had in mind that Scrooge's spirit guides would visit him, and he would go through this metamorphosis. So they started that in 1838, and then Matthew's brother, John Greenleaf Whittier, arranged for a job for him here where I am now in Portland. Actually, I'm in what used to be Westbrook, but I can look out my window and see Portland, the skyline. And they finished it there probably in 1839. Then Abby died of consumption in 1841, March 27, 1841. And of course, Matthew went through a very, very difficult period. It was in December of that year that he wrote The Raven. So he really went through a period of temporary insanity. But he was coming out of it by early 1842. Well, also, Matthew was a longtime friend of Oliver Wendell Holmes. And this is not surprising at all because Matthew's brother was John Greenleaf Whittier. Matthew, of course, the little brother tags along, and the little brother has access to the same social circle that the big brother does. We know that. He might kind of be ignored. He might be called the brother of the poet. Anytime you find Matthew Franklin Whittier, he's the brother of the poet, But nonetheless, he was there. And because he was a humorist, he wrote humorous poetry and anecdotes and so on. He would click with certain of those people in that social circle. Well, Oliver Wendell Holmes, as we know, wrote poetry and humorous poetry and so on. And so they kind of clicked. So when Matthew was editing the New York Constellation under Asa Green, he would print the poetry and prose of his brother and also that of Oliver Wendell Holmes. So I have reason to believe that their friendship goes back to 1830. And I have a pretty strong indication that it goes back at least to 1838 or so, which means that he knew Oliver Wendell Holmes personally, at least as of the time that Holmes was going to, Harvard, I think, medical school. Forgive me if I'm wrong on some of these details. I didn't really prepare for this other than to read my paper through. But anyway, definitely by 1838, Matthew was friends with Oliver Wendell Holmes, and he mentions that he's friends with him as of 1850. So Oliver Wendell Holmes was one of the people who helped to prepare the way and or to invite Charles Dickens to Boston in January of 1842. So he was instrumental in that visit. And Matthew was good friends with him. Now, when Dickens came, they threw a big dinner party for him as a welcome. And 150 authors were invited to that dinner. Now, Matthew had been an author since he was a child prodigy in 1825 as a boy of 12. And he would have definitely attended. I know that he admired Dickens because he wrote to his brother about admiring Dickens. So he would 100% definite that Matthew would have been at that dinner. But since he was personal friends with Oliver Wendell Holmes and would have wanted to be introduced, I would say it's 100% or 99.9% definite that Matthew would have been given a personal introduction. So Matthew met Charles Dickens, there's no question. There's also a letter, and this was a form letter sent by Dickens' secretary while he was still in the States, but traveling maybe a month later. And it's an acknowledgement of a letter from Matthew. And it's signed by Dickens, but the rest of it apparently was written by his secretary. So a whole bunch of these things must have been sent out as a courtesy. And it's my understanding that all these letters were destroyed, see? But people also gave Dickens manuscripts, aspiring authors and so on. And so he was loaded down with manuscripts when he came back to England, as well as the letters which were burned. I don't think the manuscripts were. So Matthew met Dickens. He corresponded with Dickens in the sense of writing him a letter for which he got a form letter back. Lots of people gave Charles Dickens manuscripts, and Dickens apparently brought them back. So that much we know about the history of the thing. Now, when Charles Dickens got back to England, he began writing about America in Martin Chuzzlewit, as I understand, not having read it, and it wasn't so well received. And his popularity was somewhat declining, and so was his bank account. Now, when Dickens was a boy, his father had been put in debtor's prison, and he'd had to work in a blacking factory or something like that. And the idea of going into debt terrified Charles Dickens. And he was living rather lavishly as a literary rock star, and he was worried. So he needed what they call a pot boiler. He needed something to boost up his bank account quickly. So I don't have any proof of this, but I'm guessing. I don't think that he wrote A Christmas Carol because he had read about reports of poverty and so on. I don't think that's what motivated him at all. I mean, historians kind of give him two motivations. That's one of them. And the other one was that he was worried about falling into debt, right? Well, the two don't really work together very well. So what he did is he was really terrified of running out of money. And he started going through these manuscripts for ideas, which is understandable, you know. So he goes through all these manuscripts and he notices the Whittier name. Well, you know, John Greenleaf Whittier was famous enough that there would be some name recognition, even though John Greenleaf Whittier didn't come to the dinner, didn't meet with Charles Dickens, didn't approve of him at that time, I think. So he noticed the Whittier name and he says, oh, let's look at this one. And he starts reading it. Of course, Christmas is coming up, you know, very soon. And he looks at it and he looks at it. And the more he reads, he says, this is he loved ghost stories. So he perceived it as a ghost story. Of course, he didn't see Abbey's higher mysticism at all. And he doesn't know real occult phenomena from a hole in the wall. So he has no idea. He has no discernment. But he knows it looks like a ghost story. And he knows that Christmas is coming up. And he says, this is it. So in 6 weeks' time, he revises this. He doesn't write it. If you go back and look at his handwritten draft, you'll see that he kind of puffed it out. He expanded it. Maybe it wasn't long enough to publish. So if you look at where he's added things, what he's added is words. He's stuck words into the sentences to make Matthew's crisp writing more Victorian, I guess you'd say, and less crisp, see? Mostly that's what he's done. The other thing he's done is to water down Abbey's spirituality. And there's a couple very strong examples in my paper. I won't go over them now. But if you read my paper, you'll find that there's proof, there's evidence that Charles Dickens watered down somebody else's much more advanced esoteric understanding, see, and spiritual understanding. He secularized A Christmas Carol to some extent. And it's impossible, it's impossible that somebody with enough spiritual power to move the world with A Christmas Carol would have watered that down. A genuinely spiritual person could not do that. They, in good conscience, they could not water down a story to make money. So it takes a worldly man, a spiritual ignoramus, to do it. So, you know, right there, we know that he didn't write it. He just popularized it and he dumbed it down and made it more sensationalized and stretched it out. And because he was already famous, see, it sold like hotcakes. He never admitted that he wasn't the author of that story. Now, after Abbey died, I think Matthew, he'd studied Stoicism and he was trying to follow the principles of Stoicism. And I think he was giving away almost all of Abbey's stuff in a fit of, you know, austerity, see? And he didn't know what to do with this manuscript. But originally, their plan was to try to change the world, to move the world so that each person of hundreds of thousands of millions of people would read this and each one would be moved to a spiritual conversion. That was their idea. I don't have any evidence of that necessarily, but I feel that, you know, that that's what they wanted to do. And you see it with the staves, I'd say. So he said, but how do I get this to all these people? You know, I mean, the same problem I've got today, you know. So in a particular sense, he sold out. He gave it to Dickens, hoping that Dickens would bite and that Dickens would publish it and spread it across the world. Well, it worked and it didn't work because Matthew had misperceived Dickens. He thought that Dickens was the way that Dickens projected outwardly, which is to say a philanthropic social reformer and a literary genius. Well, Dickens was a worldly man and a plagiarist. And where you see real social conscience in Dickens, that's somebody else that he borrowed the ideas from, see? Or then he played the role, I think, later on. So Matthew overestimated Dickens rather badly and believed that he was a social reformer like Matthew really was. See, Matthew had written social reform literature far before Dickens. Matthew had published long before Dickens had. And an interesting fact is that Dickens could have been influenced by Matthew. If Dickens got hold of the New York Constellation, where Matthew was writing some pretty advanced stuff, Dickens could have been inspired by Matthew. See, I can't say he was, I can't say he wasn't. The only thing I can say along that line is that the British Library does have a full run of the New York Constellation. Now, how they don't know when they got it, or they couldn't tell me when they got it, but somebody who wants to donate an entire run of the Constellation in America would donate it to an American institution. So it had to be somebody that got hold of it in England, which means that those are copies, bound copies that went over individually to England. Now, whether Dickens could have read it or not, we don't know. So Dickens went ahead and published this thing. And Matthew, I think, initially was very pleased. As a matter of fact, when he reviews Dickens' performances in 1867, he actually reviewed it early in 1868, but he went to a performance, a reading by Dickens in 1867. He leaves a lot of hints that Dickens wasn't really the author, but he's still not really sure, you know. He's not sure about Dickens, because it doesn't sound like he's sincere, you know, and yet he makes excuses for him and so forth. So he's very much on the fence about that. I forgot exactly the point I was going to make there. Anyway, initially, I think Matthew's very pleased. Oh, I know what it was. He intimates through the kind of code that he usually uses, where he quotes something and then you look up the quote and you find what's right under it or what's right above it. In this case, I think it's right underneath, you know. What he tells us is that when he first got his hands on A Christmas Carol, it was as though Abby had returned to him. That was the way he felt. But then I think he realized, boy, this guy really has watered this down. And he's made, you know, not only these little changes to stretch out the language, which he really didn't improve, but he's made some substantive changes as well, you know. And I think he got more and more cynical about Dickens as time went on, although I haven't ever seen him come right out and say that. You know, I've only seen inferences and hints. I do know that Matthew continued to admire Dickens for quite some time, because for a while there, I can't remember the date exactly, talking in 1847 or 1848, somewhere in there, he was writing a little series which he signed Dickens Jr., which is by way of appreciation and admiration, see. There's one unsigned review. It's a review of one of Dickens' subsequent Christmas stories. And what he says is, well, it's okay, considering he probably dashed it off in a couple days. It has a moral. It's probably worth reading. It's not as good as his earlier work, which, of course, that wasn't really his work, the early work. He says, but he really should leave the, I forget how he termed it, the mysterious or the paranormal or the esoteric. He should leave that to Bulwer, who was studied in those matters, because he really doesn't have any idea what he's doing in that realm. And that was a way of saying that he couldn't have written A Christmas Carol. I infer that from it, you know. So that's pretty much how it went down. There's a whole bunch of evidence in there. I started researching this thing 2009, I think, 2010, somewhere in there. I found Matthew in 2005. And in 2006, I recorded in my blog that I had a feeling that Matthew had something to do with A Christmas Carol. And then I just noted it. That can be found on archive.org's Wayback Machine, where I couldn't have touched it. So I can verify that I did, in fact, say that at that time in mid-2006. I didn't really start researching it until 2009 or 2010. And I wasn't sure that anything would line up at all. I said, well, what if the dates don't turn out right? You know, I had no idea. And then I found evidence that Matthew had written to Dickens, so they had contact. And then I found that he was longtime friends with Oliver Wendell Holmes. And then I read about that dinner, and I went from one discovery to another. Everything I discovered points in the direction of Matthew and Abby being the original authors. Now, the last thing I'll say about this before I close is that it's not really so fantastical at all. You know, I mean, it seems like it on the surface. First off, you have to get past this idea that I'm claiming this spuriously to try to puff up my ego as some kind of a past life hoax. I mean, that's a theory, but don't jump on it and dismiss me based on that, because it's just a theory. If you want to be rational, you have to test theories. You can't just jump on them because they're convenient. Okay? So if you look closely at this thing, you'll find that it's not that different from things we know about. That the guy that popularizes something, that has the money, that has the flair, that has the large audience, that guy is very often not the creative engine behind it. He has paid for somebody else's work. He has stolen somebody else's work. He has borrowed somebody else's idea. And he's the one that gets famous. And the other guy gets a check, you know. Now, we know of cases where that happened, where it was legitimate, where, for example, Country Roads, the song Country Roads was originally written by Bill Danoff and Taffy Nevert, I believe it was. Nobody ever's heard of them, but they wrote Country Roads. John Denver sang it with them on certain occasions and no doubt paid them for it. The Carpenters, We've Only Just Begun. I don't remember who wrote that. It was a couple guys, and it was like it was a bank commercial originally. See, that was not the Carpenters that wrote that. And the list goes on. And then there's some like Stairway to Heaven. The opening to Stairway to Heaven supposedly is exactly like something that the band Spirit wrote. And there was a big court battle. And the film Avatar, there's somebody that claims he actually wrote the screenplay for that film and sent it in, and James Cameron stole it from him, and he lost that lawsuit, but it's pretty rational. Now, there's a weird thing in society where if somebody loses a lawsuit, they have no rational claim to, what they're saying, they're dismissed. Well, that's not true, because courts are not 100% correct. For one thing, they can get bought, and for another thing, sometimes they're just plain wrong, or there's just not enough evidence, but their assertion could still be true. See, so there's a lot of cases where the famous person is not really the one that created the thing. It's all through history, and I'm sure that you may know more cases than I do. But in any case, there's nothing very strange at all about this. As a matter of fact, all the logical signs point to Charles Dickens not being the original author of this story. And then the question is, well, who was? And I have plenty of evidence by style and many other things. And some of the strongest evidence is these precursor works. I call the New Year's Bells a template. I've just recently done a video entry that goes over these two works, these two stories, New Year's Bells, which I have reason to believe was probably written about 1830, before Charles Dickens was publishing anything at all, and A Christmas Carol. See, and I read a section from this one and I read a section from that one, and it's matching point for point. So the word template is not too strong here. I really think that Matthew and Abby started with that. This is perfectly rational, perfectly logical, and all the dots are connected. So it's a question of who can believe me.